Luthando had never run this fast in his life. His feet pounded the pavement as he weaved through the narrow, crowded streets of Alexandra Township, heart racing with excitement. He didn't care about the dust kicking up beneath his worn-out sneakers or the shouts from neighbors as he nearly crashed into a group of kids playing soccer. Because today, for the first time in years, he had good news. He had a job, a real one, a high-paying construction job, the kind that could finally lift his family out of the shithole they'd been stuck in since his father died. For 3 years, since he was 17, Luthando had done whatever it took to keep his family fed and alive. Hustling on the streets, fixing broken appliances for pennies, even spending long nights in the back of restaurants washing dishes until his hands bled. It was never enough. His mother, Abina, had aged far beyond her 45 years, worn down by the weight of poverty and grief. His little brothers, Martin and Themba, went to bed hungry more often than not, and his baby sister, Xenia, barely had enough clothes to cover her tiny body. But this job changed everything. Luthando skidded to a stop in front of their one-room shack, a small structure made of corrugated iron and wood, barely held together. The door was already open. His mother sat outside, peeling potatoes in a rusted metal bowl. She barely had time to look up before Luthando burst out the news. "Mom, I got the job." Abina froze, the potato slipping from her hands. Luthando grinned. "I start in 3 days. The company office is in the city. They're putting me on a high-rise project." His mother stared at him for a long second before letting out a sharp breath, her eyes welling with tears of relief. "My boy," she whispered, pulling him into a tight embrace. He felt her body tremble, as if some of the unbearable weight she carried had finally lifted. That night, their home wasn't filled with silence. Neighbors gathered, bringing bottles of cheap beer and whatever food they could spare. Laughter filled the air. For the first time in years, Luthando felt alive. But beneath the excitement, something unsettled him. An itch at the back of his mind. Like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. He chalked it up to nerves. He was wrong. Luthando woke early, excitement still buzzing in his veins. His mother had laid out his only decent button-up shirt, the one his father had worn to church before he died. It was slightly too big, but he didn't care. The company office was in a part of Johannesburg he didn't know well, tucked away near an industrial district. The building was run down, its sign faded, a single flickering light bulb buzzing outside the door. Something about it made his stomach tighten, but he shook it off. He stepped inside. A man in a black uniform sat behind a battered desk, flipping through paperwork. He barely looked up. "Name?" "Luthando Quieta." The man nodded, motioning to a door at the back. "Orientation is in there." Luthando hesitated. The room beyond the door was dimly lit. Something felt off. Then he reminded himself this was his shot, his future. He stepped inside. The door slammed shut behind him. A sharp pain exploded in the back of his skull. Darkness swallowed him. Luthando woke to blistering heat and the sound of metal striking rock. He wasn't in the city anymore. His head throbbed, his throat dry as dust. He pushed himself up from the hard ground, blinking through the haze of dirt. And that's when he saw it. Hundreds of men, some young, others frail and starving, digging furiously under the watchful eyes of heavily armed men. The realization hit him like a brick wall. He had been kidnapped. The job had been a scam, a trap. He was in an illegal gold mining town. His stomach twisted. A shadow loomed over him. "Get up." Luthando turned. A soldier stood over him, rifle slung across his back, face hidden behind a black scarf. But it was the eyes that struck him. cold, merciless. The soldier kicked him hard in the ribs. Luthando gasped, pain exploding through his side. I said, "Get the fuck up." Luthando staggered to his feet, heart slamming against his ribs. You work, or you die. Luthando quickly learned that the heat wasn't the worst part. It was the soldiers. They were a part of a massive crime syndicate, running the illegal gold mine operation deep in the South African wilderness. They beat, tortured, and executed workers without a second thought. But one man was feared more than any of them. Musa. He wasn't like the others. He was worse. The first time Luthando saw Musa, the man was standing over a collapsed worker, an old man, too weak to keep up. You think this is a fucking joke? Musa growled. The old man tried to speak, but Musa didn't let him. He drove his boot into the man's face, snapping his nose. The old man wailed in pain, curling up like a child. Musa drew his pistol. You slow down. You waste time. You die. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the pit. The old man's body hit the dust. Luthando clenched his fists, rage boiling in his chest. But there was nothing he could do. Not yet. Weeks passed. Workers began disappearing. At first, no one noticed. People died all the time. But then the soldiers started going missing too. And when their bodies were found, they weren't just dead. They were shredded, torn apart, mutilated, limbs scattered like broken twigs, flesh peeled back as if something had clawed through them. Luthando heard the whispers. They called it the demon wolf. 9 feet tall, silver fur that shined in the dark, eyes that glowed like fire. A creature of nightmares. Even Musa, for all his brutality, seemed afraid. Luthando should have been terrified. But a part of him, a dark part, deep inside, was waiting for it to come back. The air inside the mine was thick with dust and the stink of sweat and fear. Luthando swung his pickaxe against the rock, the shock of metal on stone vibrating through his sore arms. His blistered hands burned, and every breath tasted of dirt and despair. Around him, other men worked in grim silence, eyes hollow, faces slick with sweat. The heat was merciless, but the real terror lurked above ground. Musa. Even now, the brutal soldier stood near the mine entrance, rifle slung across his back, watching, waiting. Luthando had already seen what happened to those who slowed down. He wasn't about to be next. As the sun began to set, the work siren finally blared. Luthando let out a shaky breath and dropped his pickaxe, his muscles screaming in relief. He followed the others toward the exit, his steps heavy, his mind numb. Then he noticed something. A man was missing. Luthando frowned, glancing at the row of exhausted miners. 26. There had been 27 that morning. Another one gone. His stomach tightened. This was happening too often. That night, the screaming started. Luthando jerked awake, heart hammering. The entire camp was in chaos, men shouting, rifles cocking. He stumbled out of his hut, blinking through the darkness. And then he saw it. A soldier's body lay sprawled in the dirt, his uniform soaked in dark, glistening blood. His throat had been ripped out, his arms gone, ripped clean from their sockets. Luthando swallowed a rising wave of nausea. He had seen men shot, beaten, stabbed, but this was something else. Musa stood over the corpse, his cold eyes scanning the trees. The other soldiers whispered among themselves, their grip on their AK-47s tighter than usual. This wasn't one of the captives fighting back. this was something else. Luthando heard the rumors in hushed voices. The beast got him. It's the demon wolf. I saw it last night, near the trees. Musa suddenly whirled around, his face twisting in fury. Shut your goddamn mouths, he bellowed. It's a fucking wild animal. A leopard, a lion, I don't care. We're in the middle of nowhere. That's all this is. Luthando wasn't convinced, and neither were the soldiers. The mood had changed. Even the soldiers, who had once terrorized the workers with absolute control, now looked over their shoulders at night. Their guns stayed loaded, lights burned longer. But no one, not even Musa, dared venture beyond the flickering torches after dark. Luthando lay awake in his cot, listening, waiting. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, he heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the trees beyond the camp. Luthando's heart was beating rapidly through his chest. Then came the heavy footsteps. Something big was out there. It was watching, waiting. By morning, another soldier was gone, vanished without a trace, like a ghost in the darkness. The remaining men were shaken, their cocky bravado fracturing like glass. One soldier, young, barely out of his teens, refused to leave his tent. I'm not going back out there, he muttered, clutching his rifle. Musa's shadow fell over him. You don't want to leave? The soldier asked. Fine. Musa pulled his pistol and blew his brains out in front of everyone. The camp went silent. The other soldiers stared at their fallen comrade, their faces broken. Musa holstered his gun. No one leaves, he growled. No work, no fucking money. Anyone who wants to leave dies. No one argued, but the fear in their eyes told Luthando everything he needed to know. Even the soldiers were afraid now. That night, Luthando sat by the campfire, staring into the dancing flames. He was exhausted, starving, but he couldn't sleep, not after what he had heard. The other captives spoke in hushed whispers, their faces hollowed by pure fear. The beast is real, an old man murmured. I saw it, another whispered. Last night, by the trees, glowing eyes, silver fur, huge claws. It was standing up like a man. Luthando exhaled sharply. Part of him wanted to deny it, to pretend it was just a story. But he had seen the bodies, and deep down, in the pit of his soul, he felt it. Something was out there. Something was coming. And no one, not even Musa, would be able to stop it. The attack came at midnight. Luthando awoke to the sound of gunfire. Screams tore through the camp. He scrambled out of bed, heart pounding, and saw chaos. Soldiers fired blindly into the darkness, their faces twisted in terror. Something moved between the shadows. Fast, too fast, with supernatural speed. Then Luthando saw it. A towering figure, standing just at the edge of the light. Not a man, not a wolf, something in between. It stood 9 feet tall, its silver fur rippling, reflecting the flickering flames of the camp. Its eyes burned golden, locked onto the camp like a predator sizing up cornered prey. Its face shifted left and right, like an obese man at an all-you-can-eat buffet. A deep, rumbling growl rumbled from its chest. The soldiers kept firing. It didn't flinch. Then it moved. And all hell broke loose. Luthando watched, frozen in horror, as the beast lunged forward with inhuman speed. A soldier screamed, his rifle shaking. The creature tore his throat out. Blood sprayed across the dirt. Another soldier turned to run. The beast pounced, driving massive claws into his spine, tearing it from the back. His body crumpled like paper. Screams filled the air. bullets flying everywhere, but the demon was unstoppable. It moved like a shadow, cutting down the soldiers one by one. Luthando couldn't breathe. His mind screamed at him to run, to hide, but his legs refused to move. The beast turned to him, and for the first time, it locked eyes with him. Luthando's blood ran cold. The golden eyes studied him, piercing deep into his soul, like it could feel the fear and pain coming out of him. As suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the night, leaving behind only the dead and mutilated bodies of soldiers and mine workers. The camp was a graveyard. Blood soaked the ground, mixing with the dirt, turning it into a thick, black sludge beneath Luthando's feet. He forced himself to breathe, to take in the reality of what had just happened. The demon wolf was real. Not a rumor, not a myth. A living nightmare, and it had torn through the camp like a phantom of death, leaving nothing but shredded bodies and terror in its wake. The survivors, both captives and soldiers, were left to pick up the pieces. But the truth was clear. No one was safe anymore. A low groan pulled Luthando's attention toward the smoldering wreckage of a supply tent. From beneath the collapsed structure, a bloodied hand twitched. Luthando's stomach clenched. The brutal overseer was still alive. For a brief, terrible second, Luthando considered leaving him there, letting him bleed out, just like he had let so many others die without mercy. But his body moved on its own, his survival instincts taking over. He rushed forward, gripping Musa's arm and pulling him free from the debris. Musa let out a pained growl, his chest heaving as he struggled to his knees. His uniform was torn to shreds, his once intimidating figure now hunched and wounded. For the first time, Musa looked vulnerable and human. Luthando swallowed. "You're lucky to be alive." Musa spat blood onto the dirt. "Shut up." Luthando tensed, his grip tightening. "You don't get to act tough anymore," he hissed. "That thing could have killed you." Musa met his gaze, and for a moment, something flashed in his eyes. Out of 30 soldiers, only 7 remained. The rest had been ripped apart in the night, their mangled bodies strewn across the camp. The captives, once too scared to look Musa in the eye, now stood watching him closely, their fear of him starting to fade. The balance had shifted. For the first time, Musa wasn't the biggest predator here. One of the soldiers, a burly man with a nasty scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "Boss, what do we do now?" Musa stared at the ripped-up tents, the severed limbs, the blood-soaked sand. His jaw clenched. "We move out," he said. "We can't stay here." The soldier frowned. "Move out? Where?" Musa wiped blood from his face. "There's another camp a few kilometers from here. More men, more guns." Luthando froze. More of them? He wasn't going to let himself be thrown into another camp, another hellhole. He needed to get out. Now. Luthando sat near the remnants of the campfire, his mind racing. He needed to find a way to escape before Musa and his men could regroup. But he also knew the forest was dangerous. The demon wolf was still out there, watching, waiting. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "You planning to run?" Luthando turned to see Jabu, the older worker who had been in the mines longer than anyone else. Luthando didn't answer. Jabu smirked. "I thought so." He glanced toward the remaining soldiers, his expression darkening. "If you run, do it soon. Once they get back to that outpost, we'll all be dead men walking." Luthando's stomach twisted. He'd known it deep down, but hearing it out loud made it feel final. This wasn't about working anymore. Musa would kill them all to cover up what had happened here. The reality is, Musa had to answer to men more brutal than him. which meant there was no choice. They had to run. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the plan was set. Luthando, Jabu, and a handful of other captives would make their escape while Musa and the soldiers were distracted, gathering supplies. It was a risk, but staying meant certain death. Luthando's pulse hammered as he crouched near the tree line, his eyes locked onto Musa's position. The overseer was sharpening his knife, speaking in low tones to the remaining men. Now was their chance. Luthando nodded to Jabu. They moved. One step, then another. The grass crunched softly beneath their feet. Almost there. Then, a single snap of a twig. Luthando froze. Musa's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto them. And just like that, the camp exploded into chaos. They're running. Musa was on his feet in seconds, gun raised. Luthando bolted. Jabu and the others followed, their feet pounding against the ground as gunshots rang out behind them. Bullets tore through the trees, splintering bark and kicking up dirt. Luthando ran faster than he ever had in his life. The forest closed in around them, the darkness thick and suffocating. He could hear Musa shouting orders, the soldiers charging after them. But then a new sound, a low, inhuman growl. Luthando's blood turned to ice. The creature was here. A shadow shifted in the trees ahead. Glowing golden eyes pierced the darkness. Luthando skidded to a stop. The others crashed into him, nearly toppling over. One of the men, a younger worker, barely out of his teens, let out a frantic sob. "We have to keep moving." Luthando didn't answer, because he knew. They weren't running anymore. They were being hunted. A deep, guttural snarl echoed through the trees. The men shrank back, their voices letting out cries of terror. Then, from out of the trees, the wolf demon stepped forward. And for the first time, Luthando saw it up close. It was even more terrifying standing so close to it. Its silver fur shimmered, sleek yet wild, almost unnatural in how it caught the moonlight. Muscles rippled beneath its skin, each movement fluid and deadly, its eyes burning, gold and intelligent. Not just an animal, an unknown super predator. Luthando knew it was deciding what to do with them. From behind them, Musa and his remaining men burst through the trees, rifles raised. Musa's gaze snapped from Luthando to the beast. For the first time in his life, the brutal soldier hesitated. Then, he let out a furious snarl. "You want to fight, monster? Come get me." He opened fire. The bullets ripped through the night, each shot like a thunderclap. The bullets seemed to have no effect on this creature, not a trace of blood coming from the bullets impacting its chest. It didn't even flinch. It charged. And Musa, the monster of the mines, met a monster far worse. Musa didn't run. Even as the creature charged, bullets tearing at its chest, the brutal soldier stood his ground, teeth clenched, face twisted in pure rage. A pure psychopath. Luthando had seen Musa's cruelty, his merciless rule over the mines. But this was something else. This wasn't just anger or survival. It was arrogance. It was pride. Musa had spent years being the literal serial killer in the mines. A predator, a tyrant, an agent of Lucifer himself. And now, he refused to believe he was no longer the one in control. The beast hit him like a storm. Musa rolled with the impact, hitting the ground in a cloud of blood-stained dust. The beast was on him immediately, lunging with massive clawed hands. But Musa was fast, faster than anyone should have been with ribs cracked from the fight before. He twisted at the last second, drawing his hunting knife, and plunged it deep into the beast's side. The blade sank into its flesh. The creature let out a deep, guttural growl, not of pain, but annoyance. Musa's face was twisted in shock and fury, yelling out profanities. He ripped the blade downward, trying to carve deep into the beast's belly, but the creature's massive hand closed over his wrist. With one brutal motion, it snapped the bone like a twig. Musa screamed, his knife falling into the dirt. The remaining men stood there, terrified, aiming their guns at the monster, but couldn't get a shot off in fear of killing Musa during the showdown. The beast wasn't done. It grabbed him by the throat, claws sinking into his flesh, lifting him into the air like he weighed nothing. Musa's arms thrashed, kicking wildly, trying to break free. But the more he struggled, the tighter the grip became. Luthando stood frozen, watching the man who had ruled this place with an iron fist, now dangling like a helpless rag doll in the beast's grasp. The man who had laughed as he tortured captives, who had executed slaves like sport, who had built his power on the suffering of others, now pleading with his eyes for mercy. And the demon wolf, it gave him none. With a snarl, it tightened its grip with both claws and ripped him in half. Blood exploded into the air, painting the dirt black in the firelight. Musa's upper body fell first, landing with a wet thud. His severed lower body dropped a second later, twitching for a few seconds before going limp. The creature stood over the ruined remains, its chest heaving, its silver fur now drenched in blood. No one spoke. The few surviving soldiers had already started to back away, their weapons trembling in their hands. Luthando felt like the air itself had frozen. Then, the beast turned its head and locked eyes with him. Luthando's breath hitched. The beast was right there, no more than 10 feet away. Its golden eyes glowed, not just with primal hunger, but with intelligence. It wasn't just a mindless monster. It was thinking, deciding. The same way a lion studies a wounded animal before striking, or chooses to walk away. Luthando felt every muscle in his body scream at him to run, but he couldn't. Deep down, he knew running would make him prey. So instead, he stood still. It took a step forward, its breath hot and heavy, its chest rising and falling, deep, controlled motions. It sniffed the air. It leaned in closer. Luthando's entire body locked up as the creature's snout came within inches of his face. He could see the blood dripping from its fangs, smell the flesh and iron in its breath. It could kill him in an instant. But it didn't. Instead, it growled low and deep, then turned away. In one swift, silent motion, it disappeared into the trees like a phantom of the night, leaving Luthando and the other captives alive. The remaining soldiers ran, not toward the forest, not toward a fight. They fled, disappearing into the night, wanting nothing to do with this place anymore. The captives stood frozen, their faces filled with shock, with awe, with terror. Jabu was the first to speak. It spared you. Luthando swallowed hard. Yeah, Jabu shook his head. Why? Luthando had no answer. He was wondering the same thing himself. Luthando couldn't sit and ponder that thought for too long, because he and the captives couldn't stay here. Not with that thing still out there. Not with the chance that more soldiers might come. They needed to leave, now. They all walked back to the camp they came from. Their eyes darted to the edge of the ruined camp. A pickup truck sat parked near the entrance, the body of a dead soldier slumped against the driver's side door. His hands trembled as he rushed forward, dragging the corpse out of the way. He checked the dead soldier's pockets, the keys, His heart slammed against his ribs as he jumped in, shoving the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. "Get in," he shouted. The other captives didn't hesitate. They piled into the back, gripping the rusted frame. Luthando threw the truck into gear and slammed the pedal to the floor. The camp vanished behind them. The roads stretched ahead, winding hours through the South African countryside. For the first time in weeks, he saw something that made his chest tighten and his eyes tear up. The city skyline. Home. If you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe to Descent into the Unknown for more horror content. If you have any real cryptid encounters, or you're a horror writer wanting to share your stories, please feel free to email me in the description anytime.